Hello, this is Abnormal Psychology, and we're going to talk today about dissociative disorders, and this is part one. So we're going to talk about three members of this group of disorders, and they are dissociative identity disorder, dissociative amnesia, and depersonalization, derealization disorder. Okay? So have you ever had the experience of driving someplace and then arriving but not having any memory of having driven there? That's a dissociation. Have you ever had the experience where you felt like you didn't understand or hear or even register that someone was speaking to you for a long period of time? You didn't hear any of it or only at the beginning? That's a dissociation. You ever had the experience that maybe other people or objects in the world are not somehow real, they are somehow robotic or not alive in some way? That's a dissociation. We find that there are fairly consistent studies that show that a fair percentage of people, 83% of people actually, miss parts of conversation, sometimes long parts, due to this splitting off of consciousness, this dissociation. About 56% of people talk aloud to themselves, and I think the number may actually be higher. You know, this data is all received through surveys, and so surveys can be ones which contain errors in the way they're constructed. So feeling as if someone, as if you looked in the mirror and you didn't recognize yourself, or you thought you were two different people, or you more than one person. That's a form of dissociation as well. That fantasy somehow seems real. That's a kind of dissociation, if you're an adult. Hearing voices, well, 25% of people have heard voices. You hear someone behind you, and or you hear voices. That can be either a hallucination or a dissociation. So all of these things are not uncommon, in some cases common, in the general population. Only when it is recurrent and is disturbing or interrupts the flow of life, causing problems, is it considered to be problematic. Okay? So think about what dissociation is, and then we'll talk about what it's not. So there is normal dissociation, which is really a way in which different parts of a person's identity or memories or consciousness in some way become split off from one another. Okay? And so it at least for a brief period of time, feels as if you can't get all those things interacting in a flow that they normally would be in. Okay? So dissociation is something that simply represents a misfiring of the elements of our brain that cause us to believe everything we perceive and everything we process is part of a seamless experience. Okay, so dissociation is an interruption of that seamlessness. But really it's an apparent seamlessness. Okay? In the same way that when you look at something, it appears to be as if it were continuous and as if it were a movie. And in reality, we're actually just seeing frames one by one at a high rate, and your brain combines them to create seamlessness. Okay? Interesting. So, what are these dissociative disorders? What do they have in common? Glad you asked. The first thing is that often what happens is a person becomes aware that they are unaware of certain parts of their identity or memory. It could be alterations in or detachments of parts of the world around them. can't recall aspects of themselves except under certain circumstances, such as hypnosis. And it can also include unusual perceptual experiences, which forms a continuum with what we call hallucinations. The onset is generally sudden. The onset is often but not always related to severe emotional or physical trauma. And it is in the absence of brain injuries or drugs. We know that drugs can cause dissociation and hallucination, and we know that brain injuries, traumatic brain injuries, and other forms of insults to the brain can cause this form of detachment within that seamless consciousness that we hold so dear. So let's first talk about depersonalization and derealization disorder. Okay, this disorder is very, very odd, to say the least. It's full of anxiety because the anxiety involves a frightening feeling that one is detached from reality, even that one is feeling somewhat mechanical or robotic, or that other people appear mechanistic or robotic. And these dominate their lives, and for a long period of time, chronically, perhaps waxing and waning, but this is a chronic condition. And so you would expect correctly that there are also comorbid conditions like anxiety disorders and depression. Mm-hmm. Usually the onset is around 16, and it may be triggered, we think, by certain drugs like ecstasy, which has both a psychotic inducement feature, but also it has an amphetamine-like effect as well. So here's what people often say. Well, let me go back for a minute. I hope you're following in the PowerPoint. I'm talking now about the difference between depersonalization and derealization to specify that more. So depersonalization is really about experiences of unreality, as if you were sometimes a fly on a wall watching what's going on, including yourself. This could be with respect to thoughts or feelings, or even one's body, okay? So there is actually perhaps a disconnection with parts of your body. Oliver Sacks wrote a book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. He talks about a case of depersonalization, derealization in there that's very interesting to read about if you should pick that book up. And so there's often with this in depersonalization a distortion of time, so it becomes slower or sometimes faster, an unreal or absent self, like you're missing in the world. And there may also be emotional and physical numbing, you see. Okay. So in this way, numbing is a feature wherein you're not receiving impulses from your efferent nerves. Okay? And so there's another way in which there's a disconnection of your perceptual products as they arrive in the brain and are then made sense of. Derealization is an unreality or detachment with surroundings, and it can can even include perceptions of alterations in size of objects and shapes. There's even a Lilliput possibility where you're seeing things as if they were very, very small, people mainly. Now that's probably a form of hallucination. I'm not really sure where to put that one. It's a delusion, essentially, I guess, really, and then a sense that other people are unfamiliar or mechanical. Okay, now this sense that other people seem unfamiliar where they ordinarily would be familiar coincides with, overlaps with what has been called the Capgras delusion, which is related to a biological process in which the neural pathway that goes from the amygdala to the eyes, and then back again in the rear of the brain to it's severed, so that you're not actually getting an emotional response from the things and the people that normally you would get a warm fuzzy feeling from. Yeah, it's something that doesn't last a long time. It generally repairs itself in one way or another. In fact, the auditory pathways are not usually damaged as well, and so it begins to compensate for this loss of electrical product to the amygdala. So it's an overlap to that, but the difference is that Capgras corrects itself usually within a few months. Derealization does not. Now, this is not psychosis. This is not truly hallucination. It's not truly delusion, because everybody who has this, typically anyway, is able to distinguish between what's real and what's not. In other words, they can distinguish between the internal experiences that they have and the objective reality of the outside world, which is not something people who are psychotic are able to do. It does not they do not in any way represent a risk to anyone else, because their grasp on reality remains very stable at all times. Okay. People who see them from the outside often can't see anything. They may see the depression that develops or the anxiety that accompanies it. They don't typically see symptoms from the outside of this disorder. Okay. How common is this? Well, we don't really know. It's probably more common than we know, simply because if it's a chronic condition and others can't tell that it's in existence by looking at someone, the person who has it will become able to adjust to it in some ways and go about their lives, feel other things like depression, and may get treated for depression but never have a diagnosis of this disorder. So, again, we don't really know what the percentage is. Probably less than 1% at the low end. At the high end, 10%? That's probably excessive. I don't know. What do clients say? So you're treating a client. What do they say to you? They say that they feel like they're going through the motions on a daily basis. They're living their lives, but they're not experiencing it. It feels as if they're in a movie. They say, I feel like I'm living in a dream or a movie or something. They feel disconnected. They have to their bodies. They may say, I have an out-of-body experience. Sometimes out-of-body experiences are related to this disorder. Sometimes they are related to hypnopompic and hypnagogic hallucinations, when you're either falling asleep or becoming awake. And incidentally, that's another example of the way in which seamlessness in our shifts in conscious states is normally what we experience, but at times where our brain waves are switching out because our level of consciousness is shifting, we have these weird hallucinations, like we can't move our body, and we actually may see things in the room that are not there, or hear things that are in a different volume, and so that's actually described as two forms of hallucinations. Interesting. So there's a word problem here, I think, or concept problem. So what else do they say? Well, they describe it as if time is passing them by and they are not in the present. They will say, I can interact with everybody, but it doesn't feel real. See? Okay. Interesting, isn't it? Okay. Now, what are the risks? What are the things that correlate in a person or people amassed by survey and history taking? that seem to line up with this disorder. Well, severe traumatic events, childhood physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, accidents, war, may aggravate these things. I mentioned some of that. It's not clear whether genetics play a role. Probably does, but that's because in most disorders, genetics plays a role. We just don't know about this one. There is some evidence of physiological factors. So, for example, in brain function, we see people who have this disorder show deficits in attention. They have short-term memory problems, and they have some deficiency in spatial temporal reasoning. That can be seen earlier in their lives before they develop this disorder. You have to rule out some things. One is temporal lobe epilepsy. You have to rule out panic disorder, acute stress disorder, PTSD as well, schizophrenia, migraines, chronic migraine headaches, drug abuse, you got to know which drugs, brain tumors, brain lesions, brain injury, all those things have correlations. Now, there was a separate disorder which has now been subsumed within this category of dissociative disorder, depersonalization, derealization disorder. It was called dissociative fugue, and it is simply a form of this disorder in which a person actually feels unreal, unconnected, and what they do is, in the presence of the anxiety that creates, is they go into almost a trance-like state, a faraway look, and they will leave where they are and go, maybe even get on a bus and go someplace else and establish a new identity. How about that? Take on a new job. Usually within the gray market, the gray economy, where they don't have to produce a social security card or give their right name. They're paid in cash, that kind of thing. And usually these things are triggered by trauma in the past, which then has present cues like being in a crowded place, for example, or being in a place which they don't have control over. That can can trigger this fugue state. Now, this fugue state is rare, we think. It is one which also involves then, when they get to their new place and have a new identity, a new name, they can't remember anything from the past. They don't remember where they were, who they were living with, and what they used to do. And although the new identity may or may not be something that all of them acquire, but most of them do, they do forget their past identity. And if and when the fugue state resolves, which can be weeks, months, usually not more than that, the old identity returns, and the new identity, if they acquired one, they can't remember now. How about that one? That tells you a lot about the true nature of the brain being somewhat compartmentalized in terms of processes, okay? Not in little areas of particular cells, but in the processes, which involve many parts of the brain in any given moment. So in our brains, there are many places active, others less active, some almost inactive. But these move constantly, creating what we think is this seamless consciousness that we have. And so we say compartmentalization, meaning there's some parts that can be less well connected than they should be, which then results in these kinds of experiences. And it's not that unusual, my original comments about dissociation, but if the compartmentalization, the way in which this seamlessness becomes more altered, then creates problem or it becomes quite chronic, then you've got problems. Then there's something with the brain that's going on, and we don't really necessarily know what that is. We have a lot to learn. How do you treat this? How do you treat this particular disorder, fugue state or otherwise? Well, we want the person to come to terms with the stress that they're under. So the first thing we would do is we would want to do an assessment to see if they can learn, and if so, teach them relaxation skills so that they get very good at that and they can relax themselves very quickly in the present moment. because as I said, this disorder creates a lot of anxiety. And in fact, in other countries, this disorder, depersonalization, derealization disorder, is actually in anxiety disorders. At any rate, find out maybe what the original traumas were. There may be one big one. There may be a number of big ones or a number of small ones. We don't know till we figure it out, and we may not figure it out. And you've got to go slow with the uncovering of that, okay? You've got to be respectful in uncovering that. So the best approach really beyond that involves the severity of the situation and the symptoms. And what we often do is to offer supportive psychotherapy, where we're a team member. We will educate the family. We will help them understand what's going on, help the patient understand this, and teach them coping skills. We may, depending on the client, give them cognitive behavior therapy. Okay? All right. Now, the next is dissociative amnesia. Dissociative amnesia occurs when something very stressful occurs, maybe even life-threatening, which is usually the precursor for dissociative amnesia, and they become unable to remember anything, which is a generalized form, or a failure to remember or recall specific events at specific times. That's localized or selective dissociative amnesia. Okay? So someone may have a very disturbing experience and then can't remember important aspects about who they are and what they're supposed to be doing and so forth and so on. Okay. But usually it's a localized or selective kind of amnesia. It may be for parts of their identity or parts of their life history. So this is beyond normal forgetfulness. It's way beyond that. It often involves an inability to recall a traumatic event. Now, Freud would have called this repression. You can call it that if you want, but we probably are getting closer, I hope we will anyway, get closer to discovering the biological nature of this sort of dissociative process. The memories still exist, but they're buried, and they can't be recalled by the individual. They're still there. They might resurface on their own, or they might come back being triggered by something in the surroundings of the person, and in which case they come flooding back. There's that compartmentalization again, you see. We think this one is somewhere less than 2%, much more so for females than males, maybe up to 2.5% for females, maybe only 1% for males, something like that. That order of magnitude anyway. Risks, same risks as before. We don't have any genetics on this one, but it is linked to this overwhelming stress resulting from the same kinds of things, traumatic events in childhood or in recent history, war, abuse, accidents, disasters, those kinds of things. Same sort of stuff. How do you treat it? Well, there's no medication for really any of these. If they have depression or anxiety, we could treat that with meds, or we could treat that with therapy. Supportive psychotherapy, yet again, is appropriate, including family therapy, again. Okay, part 2 coming up.